Home is supposed to be the one place where the locks are meant to keep the world out, not keep you trapped inside. But for some, the most dangerous predator isn't a stranger in the woods, but the person who tucked them into bed. We tell ourselves that evil has a specific face, a monster's mask that we would recognize from a mile away. In reality, the greatest horrors are often hidden behind the most boring curtains in the quietest neighborhoods. In Amstetten, Austria, a man named Joseph Fritzl built a kingdom of concrete and wires beneath his family's feet. For 24 years, his daughter Elizabeth lived in a world that didn't exceed the width of a few narrow rooms. She was kept behind 8 separate doors, some weighing several hundred pounds, reinforced with steel and hidden by a shelf. Every time the heavy mechanism groaned open, it wasn't a sign of rescue, but a precursor to a recurring nightmare. She raised children in the dark, teaching them about a sun they had never seen and a sky they couldn't imagine. The air they breathed was recycled through a humming ventilation system that never quite removed the smell of damp earth. Upstairs, Joseph's wife cooked meals and watched television, never realizing her own grandchildren were crying beneath her floorboards. He told the world she had run away to join a cult, a lie he maintained for over 2 decades of silence. The basement was soundproofed so well that even the most desperate screams were swallowed by the thick concrete walls. Time became a blurred concept, where the only clock was the sound of a key turning in a lock once a day. It was a masterpiece of cruelty, designed by a man who wanted to own a human soul completely and utterly. But even the most carefully constructed prisons eventually crack under the weight of the truth they try to bury. Sometimes, the crack begins with a single illness that the master of the house cannot ignore or hide away. When Elizabeth's oldest daughter fell critically ill, the carefully built facade of the Fritzl household began to crumble. Joseph was forced to take the girl to a hospital, a move that finally brought the light of the world into his dark kingdom. Doctors were baffled by the girl's condition and the mysterious note she carried, pleading for help for her family. The police began to dig, not into the ground, but into the history of a man who seemed perfectly ordinary to his neighbors. When they finally entered the basement, the smell was the first thing that hit them, a mixture of rot, sweat, and stagnant air. They found a labyrinth of low ceilings and cramped rooms where 3 people had spent their entire lives in shadows. Elizabeth was 42 years old when she finally stepped out into the air, her skin pale and her eyes sensitive to the light. Her children looked at the sky for the first time, seeing a world they thought was only a story told by their mother. The world watched in horror as the details of the House of Horrors were revealed, one agonizing layer at a time. Joseph Fritzl sat in a cell, his face showing no remorse, only the cold calculation of a man who felt he was the victim. He had built his own world because he couldn't control the one above, turning his family into his private property. The psychological scars left on the survivors were deeper than any wound, a trauma that would take lifetimes to heal. They were moved to a secret location, hidden away from the prying eyes of a world that was fascinated by their pain. But even in safety, the sound of a closing door or a flickering light could pull them back into the concrete abyss. The Amstetten house was eventually filled with concrete, a literal attempt to bury the evil that had lived inside its walls. Yet, the memory of what happened there remains a stain on a quiet street, a reminder that we never truly know our neighbors. Because while one basement was filled with concrete, others were being prepared for a different kind of nightmare. The survivors of the Fritzl basement had to learn how to exist in a world where space didn't have a ceiling. For the children, the concept of distance was a terrifying new reality that their minds struggled to process. They had lived in a world where you could touch every wall without taking more than 10 steps. Elizabeth, now a middle-aged woman, had missed the entire arc of her youth, stolen by the man she once called father. She had to explain to her children that the monster who hurt them was also the one who brought them food. The trial of Joseph Fritzl was a media circus, but the man himself remained a cold, empty vessel of arrogance. He hid his face behind a blue folder, as if the shame was something he could simply block out with a piece of card. He was sentenced to life in a psychiatric ward, a fate that many felt was too merciful for the king of the cellar. The house in Amsterdam became a dark monument, a place where locals whispered and tourists took ghoulish photos. It was eventually gutted, every piece of furniture that witnessed the crime hauled away and destroyed. But concrete cannot fill the holes left in the minds of those who were forced to call the darkness home. They live under new names now, ghosts in a world that will never fully understand the weight they carry. Their story ended in a courtroom, but for many others, the story is only just beginning in a different city. Thousands of miles away, in Cleveland, Ohio, another man was watching the news and smiling at his own secrets. He didn't build a concrete bunker, but he used the same tools: fear, chains, and a house that looked perfectly normal. Ariel Castro was a school bus driver, a man trusted with children, while he kept 3 women in his own basement. The horror was moving from the quiet suburbs of Austria to the crowded streets of an American city. In the heart of Cleveland, Ohio, there stood a house on Seymour Avenue that seemed to blend perfectly into the gray urban decay. To the people living next door, Ariel Castro was just a quiet neighbor who kept his curtains drawn and his private life hidden. He was a man who spent his days driving school buses, safely transporting children while keeping 3 young women chained below. Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DiJesus disappeared into the shadows of that house, becoming ghosts in an urban forest. They were kept in separate rooms, their windows boarded over with wood and reinforced with heavy plastic to ensure no sound escaped. The silence of the house was a weapon used to break their spirits, a psychological weight that grew heavier with every year. Castro would often leave the radio or television playing at high volumes to drown out any screams that might have escaped. For over a decade, these 3 women survived on meager portions of food, living in a constant state of total sensory deprivation. They were forced to endure a routine of violence and degradation that was so systematic it felt like a permanent, inescapable law. Outside, the world continued to move. Neighbors mowed their lawns and children played in the street, completely unaware of the hell. There were moments when the women could hear the muffled sounds of life through the walls, a cruel reminder of freedom. But every time they thought about screaming, the memory of punishments acted as a silent, suffocating hand over their mouths. Ariel Castro was a master of manipulation, building a fortress of distrust and psychological isolation within their prison. He even fathered a child with Amanda Berry, a little girl born into the darkness who would eventually become the key to escape. As the years stretched into a decade, the hope of rescue began to fade, replaced by a dull, aching acceptance of reality. They had become experts at reading the sounds of the house, knowing exactly when the monster was coming by the floor's creak. But on May 6, 2013, a rare moment of negligence by their captor provided a crack in the door that would shatter the silence. On that warm May afternoon, Ariel Castro left the house, unaware that he had failed to secure the heavy outer door. Amanda Berry, sensing a change in the house, crept toward the door and realized it was her only chance to save her daughter. She reached the heavy door and began to scream with a ferocity that could only come from 10 long years of silence. Across the street, a neighbor named Charles Ramsey heard the strange, panicked noise and looked toward the silent house. He ran toward the porch and saw a hand reaching through a small gap in the door, pleading for a way out. Ramsey kicked at the bottom of the door, creating a hole large enough for Amanda and her young daughter to crawl through. As she tumbled onto the porch, the sunlight hit her face for the first time in a decade, a sensation like a physical blow. She ran to a neighbor's house and dialed 911, her voice shaking as she told the operator she had been missing for years. Within minutes, police cruisers swarmed Seymour Avenue, their sirens cutting through the quiet afternoon like a cold blade. When officers entered the house, they were met with a smell that told the story of a decade fear and decay. They found Michelle Knight and Gina DeJesus still in the dark, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. The women were rushed to the hospital, their bodies fragile and their minds shattered by systematic, long-term abuse. Ariel Castro was arrested shortly after, caught at a local fast food joint, acting as if it were an ordinary afternoon. In court, the details of his crimes were so graphic that even seasoned investigators struggled to maintain their cold composure. He was sentenced to life plus 1,000 years, a symbolic gesture intended to ensure he never breathed free air again. Just a month into his sentence, Castro was found dead in his cell, ending his life and leaving victims without answers. The house on Seymour Avenue was demolished, ground into dust to prevent it from becoming a landmark for the curious. While the horrors of Ohio were physical prisons, some nightmares are built on the terrifying reality of being watched in silence. In Tokyo, Japan, a woman noticed small, inexplicable changes in her humidor left ajar or food missing. She lived alone in a small, tidy apartment, a place where everything had its specific spot and logical explanation. But a creeping sense of dread settled in her chest as she realized she was not as alone as she believed. She installed security cameras, thinking a burglar was breaking in, but the footage revealed something much more disturbing. The video showed a man emerging from the shadows of a storage space, moving with the familiarity of a ghost. He wasn't there to steal her electronics. He was there simply to exist within her space, unnoticed and silent. For over a year, a 58-year-old man had been living in the top shelf of a built-in closet. He had carved out a life in the margins, watching her sleep and retreating into the darkness whenever she moved. When police arrived, they were stunned to find the man curled into a ball in the back of the small compartment. He had no home of his own, choosing instead to become a parasite on the life of a complete stranger. The woman moved out immediately, unable to stay in a place where the air felt heavy with his presence. This case highlighted a horror where the walls have eyes and the ceiling holds more than just dust. We often fear the locked door, but we rarely look at spaces we assume are too small for monsters. In major cities, cases of frogging are becoming a modern nightmare where the intruder lives right beside you. They use your shower while you're at work and listen to your conversations from behind the thin drywall. The scariest thing isn't the person who breaks in and leaves, but the one who stays and remains hidden. Across the world, people are discovering that their homes have been host to uninvited guests for months. They find makeshift beds in crawl spaces and the unsettling realization that their privacy was a total illusion. These intruders don't want your money. They want your life, claiming a hidden piece of it as their own. They learn your schedule, knowing exactly when it's safe to emerge and when they must become as still as furniture. It is a psychological violation that leaves the sanctuary poisoned by the lingering presence of a total stranger. Imagine waking up to see a shadow retreating into a closet that should have been locked and empty. You go back to sleep, unaware that the intruder is watching you from behind a thin layer of plaster. These stories are urban legends until police find the hidden entrance and the person living inside the structure. The human mind cannot handle the idea that a predator sits 5 feet away while you watch a movie. It turns basic elements a corner, a closed door, a crawl space into sources of paralyzing, permanent anxiety. In city life, the phenomenon is often linked to intense isolation, where some people simply choose to vanish. But vanishing into someone else's home is a choice that crosses from tragedy into a disturbing form of stalking. They become experts at moving in silence, timing their movements to the noise of the heater or traffic. They are the ultimate uninvited guests, people who inhabit the echoes of your life because they have none. When caught, they often have no explanation other than a desire for warmth and a hidden, shared life. For victims, the home is never the same. Every sound is a threat and every shadow a person. Because once you know someone lived in your walls, you can never truly trust the silence ever again. History is full of hidden kingdoms where laws are replaced by the dark whims of a powerful individual. The common thread in every case is the terrifying ability of evil to hide in plain, ordinary sight. We walk past these houses, never realizing that behind a standard door, a person lives their worst nightmare. Victims speak of a psychological breaking point where the walls of their prison become the only reality. They stop looking for doors and start looking for ways to survive the next agonizing minute in the dark. For Elizabeth Fritzl, that reality lasted 24 years, a span of time impossible for the mind to comprehend. For the women in Cleveland, it was a decade of chains that ended because of a single moment. These cases serve as a chilling reminder that the person you know might be a terrifying, total stranger. Ariel Castro was a trusted school bus driver while he maintained a decade of systematic, brutal captivity. Joseph Fritzl was a respected man whose community saw him as a tragic figure who lost his daughter. The duality of these men is the most disturbing part. They walk among us while keeping monsters below. It is living proof that evil doesn't always look like a monster. It looks like a neighbor. The trauma left behind is a permanent shadow, a weight carried long after the concrete has been poured. They must learn to trust a world that allowed them to be stolen and hidden for silent years. But how do you trust the floorboards when you know what lived just a few inches below them? Every creak becomes a question, and every closed door a potential prison for those who were taken. The nightmare ends for the public at trial, but for victims, the story is told every sunset. Fear is a physical thing, a weight in the throat and a coldness that never leaves the bones. It is the fear of being forgotten, of disappearing while being only 20 feet away from help. These cases force us to confront the frightening ease with which we ignore the suffering of others. We tell ourselves we would have heard the screams or noticed the boarded-up windows and strange behavior. But we are all experts at looking away, convincing ourselves that the strange noise was just the house. The house settling is the most common lie we tell to protect our own sense of security. Monsters thrive in the gaps of our attention, building kingdoms in spaces we refuse to investigate. They are meticulous, willing to wait years for the perfect moment to pull a life into shadows. In their world, rules of the sun no longer apply. There is only the rhythm of their footsteps. Survivors say the most terrifying part was not the violence, but the crushing boredom of the dark. It is a slow death of the soul, erasing the self until you are just a ghost shell. When light returns, it is often too late to save the person who was originally taken away. They are living monuments to cruelty, reminders that the most dangerous place is often the home. We must learn to look closer and never trust the silence of a house that seems quiet. Because right now, a door is being locked and a scream is being swallowed by concrete. The world is full of crawl spaces that hold secrets we are not meant to see or understand. As long as there is darkness, there will be those who use it to build kingdoms of silence. We have traveled through concrete dungeons, boarded up prisons, and the silent crawl spaces of the world. Each story is a fragment of a darker reality, horrific crimes that stay hidden the longest. Survivors are heroes who found light in a world designed to be pitch black and silent. They carry the weight of years in the dark, a testimony to the resilience of the human spirit. We must wonder how many others are still waiting in a basement yet to be discovered. Darkness is a space where the unimaginable becomes a daily, agonizing routine for the forgotten. These stories are a reason to look twice at the house on the corner or the neighbor. Monsters don't live in our nightmares. They live in our neighborhoods, hidden by ordinary faces. They are the masters of the locked door and the architects of the forgotten crawl space. Survivors reclaimed their lives, but the memory of the dark remains a part of their soul. We must never forget the names of those who spent thousands of days in the absolute abyss. Their stories are a call to awareness in a world that can be unimaginably, deeply cruel. As the clock ticks toward the early hours, take a moment to listen to your home. Is that creak just wood settling? Or is it something living and breathing beyond your sight? Truth is buried deep, hidden in places we are too afraid to look for light. Sleep well, but remember that for some, the nightmare is beginning in the room next door. This is Midnight County, where the darkest stories are told after midnight. Stay alert and never trust the silence.